Hey everyone. Um, this week's challenge is we need to somehow knock the robbers, these two bad guys right here, into the basement of our competition table. So I've decided I'm going to make a plow assembly for my Mini-Me so that when I drive forward I can either scoop them or push them or guide them somehow in there. So what I've done was I just grabbed a piece of my bent material from when I made the Mini-Me. When we scored the material and then broke it off, we were left with some remnants like this. So I'm going to use a piece of the remnants to make my plow assembly. So it's pretty simple. We're going to use the same techniques that we used in making the Mini-Me by storing the material, snapping the material, tin snips to cut it and whatnot. So the first thing I would recommend we do is we get our material down to size where we're going to make our plow. So if you look at this right here, this is a piece of the material that I gleaned from my waste material, and I laid out what the plow assembly is going to look like. And you can notice here that I scored my material to get it to manageable size, and then I laid out what the shape of my piece is going to be and the hole locations. This dotted line represents the center line of my plow, and the reason the center line is important is because we want our mounting holes to be equally spaced based on the center of the part, and we also want the part that's going to rest on the Mini-Me to be central to the overall width of the shovel. So that's what I did here, laying it out. And so that left me with a piece like this that to save time, I've already made a snip mark and I cut to this point right here. And then I did the same thing here, and I'm going to do the rest of it on camera so that you can actually see it. So I'm going to finish this cut. You noticed I X'd out what I have to remove. It's just a good reminder in case you get drawn away and you come back and you say, okay, I'm going to remove those. So I take my tin snips and I'm going to snip right across that line right to the previous cut and part of it. Now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to finish this cut and I'm going to follow that line as close as possible, because aesthetics actually means something. All right? I'm going to hang on to these pieces because you never know remnants. I mean, they could come in handy at some point. So I'm going to save these in my kit, and I can always throw them away at some later time. So you can see that I've made the cutouts based on how I laid this out on my remnant. All right. So the next thing I wanted to do was locate where my holes were going to be, because I've decided to use some existing studs that are being used to put the caster in place. Rather than more holes and trying to configure, why not just use what's available? Not necessarily the best practice for what we're trying to do right here. It's perfectly fine. So I needed to know what the center to center dimension is on these in order to transfer that onto my aluminum sheet so that I can just take this plow assembly and mount it on top. So this is a kind of important one, kind of a neat thing, how you measure center to center. I mean, you could take a scale and try to figure out what the center of that stud is to the center of that one, but there's a more accurate way to do that, and that's using your calipers. So I'm going to ensure they're on 0. I always check them. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure outside to outside on the stud. See if you guys can see that a little better without being in the glare. Maybe that's a good view there. So I'm measuring outside to outside of those two studs. But in order to find the center of the studs, in this case they're equal diameter, so I can measure 1 and subtract that from my outside dimension, and that will put me right on the center of those. So in this case it would be 1.55 minus whatever the diameter of this particular stud is, and that will give you what the dimension is from there to there. You can also do that internally too. You can go inside to inside And then what would you do? You would add the diameter of one of the studs. Now, if studs were of different diameter, you can still use this process. The only thing is you would have to measure each one of the studs and then figure out where the center is based on that. You know, the different radiuses of the studs. But in this case, it's the same screw diameter. So that's a cool way of doing it. So that's what I did here. And I put the holes in. And I haven't tested it, so let's see how it fits though. And so I put those right over the top. And then eventually I'm going to mount that on right in place. Now I could take these nuts out, mount it right to the Mini-Me, and then put the nuts on, but I'm going to just mount it on top of the nuts so that if I had to take my plow off, I wouldn't have to disassemble the entire caster assembly either, right? I could just take this off and then this would mean attached to my Mini-Me. It's kind of just a good practice like that. All right, so now we're to the point where we're bending. Let me show you one more little thing that I had to take into consideration. Now, if I just took from the center of the stud to the edge and bent plow down so it's like this on my Mini-Me, right? What would happen? Well, my caster wouldn't have the freedom to go 360 degrees because it would be making contact with the back of my plow. So it had to be taken into consideration, and I had to take the back side of my plow and actually extend it out a little bit so that when my plow is bent, my caster will still be able to go 360 without interfering, and you'll see that once I make that bend. So just like the process in making the Mini-Me itself, I scored the bend mark where I'm to want to bend that at 90 degrees so that it kind of looks like a plow, right? And so I'm going to do that right now. In the process, I know the groups that I had, we used, one of them was, we took our clamps. And we used our 3/4 by 3/4 inch fur, and we laid it right along the line that we want to bend this over to on. So I'm going to do that again, and notice I'm right on line, and I'm going to put my clamps relatively close to my bend because I don't want anything bending except my line. So I clamp there, and I like to leave my clamps a little bit loose at first so that I can make adjustments on the fly, and that looks pretty good. And now I'm going to put this next one on, and again I want it to be close to my bend as somewhat possible, but not being in the way when I bend over. So I'm going to lean those out a little bit, and you see there's a little bit of a gap here and a little bit of a gap here, so when I bend this. So using hands, like I did the first time bending things, I'm going to bend this over this angle right here, this 3/4 fur affords me. So I'm going to bend that over. Okay, because I made the score marks, I'm pretty confident it's going to bend right on that score mark. And then I'm going to lightly tap with my ball peen hammer just to kind of form it around this edge right here. Right, that's a nice sharp edge right here and here. I'm just going to use this and just going to tap it down. If you notice, I'm holding my hammer way up at the top. If I were to hit your finger with the same amount of pressure I'm hitting this with, you wouldn't even know it. It's just lightly tapped. Yeah, and that gives us a nice sharp bend on that. So now I'm going to take my clamps off. There's one, there's two. Get rid of my fur. And now I'm going to see how that works. And I'm going to assemble that onto my Mini-Me. And I'm going to put a washer on there. And I'm going to put my nut. And tighten that right on there. And I'm going to do the same thing for the inside. Tighten that on. Then I would use my pliers to tighten that up, but I don't need to show you that because you can see it. And there you go. You got a little plow assembly. right? Looks pretty cool. Now you could have used all 4 studs if you needed something that was more robust, but two for what I'm doing I think is fine. And then you could also take it just to bend your ears out like this a little bit so they act more as like a gatherer. See how that's like a gatherer? So if I'm coming up on this and it's on the edge, maybe it'll force it back to the center of my plow a little bit. So there it is. Real quick, basic, simple plow. Make sure of your dimensions, right? You don't want the plow dragging on the tabletop as you're doing it, right? You want it just above the table. So if this sheet here was my tabletop, you can see that there's a little gap between my contact points here, my wheels and the caster. You can see there's a gap right there, and it's not going to allow it to drag. So that's that. That's making a little plow. Now you don't have to make it like this, but that just shows you one possibility. All right, hopefully that helps.